Okay, here's something that should blow your mind right from the start. We're about to talk about someone who basically invented how we think. Not what we think about this or that topic, but the actual structure of rational thought itself. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE. And when we call him the architect of Western thought, we're not being dramatic or using some flowery academic title. We mean it. This is the guy who built the foundation, the framework, the entire blueprint for how Western civilization would approach knowledge for the next 2,000 years. Think about that for a second. 2,000 years. We're talking about someone whose ideas dominated universities, shaped scientific inquiry, and structured philosophical debate. From ancient Greece all the way through the Renaissance. That's longer than Christianity has existed. That's longer than most empires lasted. One mind reshaping how millions of people across centuries would understand reality itself. But here's what makes Aristotle truly remarkable. And this is where he differs from his teacher Plato, who we'll get into in a moment. Aristotle wasn't content to philosophize about one or two big questions. No, this man had to systematically investigate everything. Logic, physics, done. Biology, wrote the book, literally. Ethics, politics, metaphysics, poetry, rhetoric, psychology. We're talking about someone who wrote detailed treatises on the movement of stars and a classification of sea creatures, who can analyze the structure of a tragic play in the morning and contemplate the nature of being itself in the afternoon. Who studied the politics of 158 different city-states, not because he had to, but because he wanted to understand how human communities actually worked. And you know what? He wasn't just philosophizing from an armchair. Aristotle got his hands dirty. He dissected animals. He collected specimens. He observed, cataloged, and classified. He was part philosopher, part scientist, part political analyst, part literary critic. If you were alive today, he'd probably have about 7 different PhDs and still be working on more. But here's the thing that greatly matters for us. Aristotle didn't just accumulate knowledge. He created the tools we still use to organize knowledge. He invented formal logic, the system of reasoning that lets us move from premise to conclusion with accuracy. He developed the categories we use to classify the natural world. He gave us the vocabulary we still use when we talk about cause and effect, substance and accident, potential and actual. So when your slide says, from logic and metaphysics to ethics and politics, one mind that shaped the foundation of Western civilization, understand that this isn't exaggeration. This is just accurate. Uncomfortably accurate, actually, because it means that whether you know it or not, whether you've been if you ever read a word of Aristotle or not, you're thinking with tools he invented. Now let's talk about this intellectual giant actually came to be, because Aristotle's life story is fascinating, and it helps us understand why his philosophy turned out the way it did. 384 BCE, northern Greece, a place called Stagira. Aristotle is born into a family with connections. His father was a personal physician to the king of Macedon. So from the start, Aristotle is exposed to both intellectual pursuit and political power. Keep that in mind, because it'll matter later. But here's where the story really begins. At age 17, Aristotle leaves home and travels to Athens. And in Athens, there's this incredible institution called Plato's Academy. Basically the world's first university, and Aristotle joins it. Now imagine being 17 years old and studying under Plato, one of the greatest minds in human history. Aristotle stays at the academy for 20 years. 20 years! And he's not just a student. He becomes a teacher there, a researcher, a full member of this intellectual community. Plato apparently called him the mind of the school. But here's what's fascinating despite spending 2 decades studying under Plato. Aristotle ends up disagreeing with him on some of the most fundamental questions of philosophy. Plato believed in a realm of perfect, eternal forms existing beyond our physical world. Aristotle, He looked around at the actual world we live in and said, no, the answer are right here. We need to study this reality, not some abstract realm we can't even access. There's this famous saying attributed to Aristotle, amicus Plato, sed magis amica veritas. Plato is dear to me, but dear still is truth. Now, we're not entirely sure he actually said that, but it perfectly captures his attitude. He loved and respected his teacher, but he wasn't going to just accept Plato's ideas because Plato said them. He was going to follow the evidence wherever it led. So Plato dies in 347 before BCE, and Aristotle leaves Athens. Maybe he was passed over for leadership of the academy. Maybe he just needed a change. But what happens next is wild. He gets hired as a tutor, and not just any tutoring gig. He becomes the personal teacher of the 13-year-old Macedonian prince named Alexander. You know him better as Alexander the Great. Think about this. One of history's greatest philosophers personally educating one of history's greatest conquerors. For 3 years, Aristotle teaches Alexander philosophy, science, medicine, literature. He instills in this young prince a love of Homer's Iliad. Alexander will supposedly sleep with a copy under his pillow during his campaigns. He exposes him to Greek culture and learning. Now, there's debate about how much Aristotle actually influenced Alexander's later actions. Alexander conquered half the known world, spread Greek culture across 3 continents, and died at 32. Not exactly the life of contemplative philosophical wisdom Aristotle's advocated. But here's what we do know. Alexander funded Aristotle's research. He sent back specimens from his conquests. He supported the establishment of Aristotle's own school, because that's what happens next. Around 335 BCE, Aristotle returns to Athens and founds his own institution, the Lyceum. And this is where Aristotle really becomes Aristotle. The Lyceum becomes famous for its peripapatic approach, from the Greek word walking around. Aristotle and his students would discuss philosophy while strolling through the covered walkways, not sitting in rigid rows, but moving, thinking. It's a different model of educating entirely, more dynamic, more engaged. And at the Lyceum, Aristotle writes and writes and writes. We're told he produced around 200 works, treatises on everything from physics to poetry, from ethics to zoology. Now here's the tragedy. Most of them are lost. What we have today are roughly 31 surviving works, and many of those are probably lecture notes rather than polished writings meant for publication. But even these surviving fragments, these lecture notes contain enough insight, enough systematic thought, enough revolutionary ideas to dominate Western philosophy for 2 millennia. Just imagine what was in the works we lost. So when we look at this timeline on your slide, born in Staggeria, studied with Plato, tutored Alexander, founded the Lyceum, we're not just seeing a biography, we're seeing the formation of a mind that would reshape human thought. We're seeing someone who learned from the best, dared to disagree with his teacher, engaged with political power, and then created his own space to pursue knowledge on his own terms. And that pursuit of knowledge, that systematic, rigorous, empirically grounded investigation of reality, that's what we're going to explore in the rest of this lecture. Because Aristotle didn't just have interesting ideas, he created an entire method for understanding the world. And that method, that's what comes next. All right, now we get to something really crucial. And honestly, this is where Aristotle becomes genuinely revolutionary. Because it's not just what he thought about that matters, it's how he thought, his method. See, before Aristotle, philosophy was dominated by this top-down approach. You start with big abstract principles, Plato's forms, Parmenides' unchanging being, Heraclitus' eternal flux, and then you try to make sense of the messy, complicated world we actually live in. It was like trying to force reality to fit your theory. Aristotle flips this completely upside down. He says, let's start with what we can actually observe. Let's begin with the phenomena. The phenomena, the things that appear to us, is experience. Let's look at what people actually believe, what seems true based on common experience, the endoxa, the reputable opinions, and then from there, let's build up our theories. This is huge. This is a complete methodological revolution. Aristotle is essentially inventing what we'd later call the empirical method, the foundation of all modern science. But here's what makes it philosophically sophisticated. Aristotle isn't saying just trust your senses, or common sense is always right. No, he's saying start with observation and common belief, but then subject them to rigorous logical analysis, test them, push them, and see if they hold up under scrutiny. He calls this the endoxic method, starting from reputable opinions, examining dialectically, resolving contradictions, and arriving at more refined understanding. It's like he's saying, look, people aren't complete idiots. If most people believe something, there's probably some truth in it. Our job is to figure out what that truth is and separate it from the errors. Take this biology, for example. Aristotle didn't just sit around theorizing about what animals might be like. He dissected them. He observed them in their habitats. He cataloged over 500 species. He noticed that dolphins gave live birth and nursed their young. And he correctly classified them as more similar to land animals than to fish. This was 2,300 years before modern biology caught up with him. Or consider his studies of embryology. He cracked open chicken eggs at different stages of development and carefully documented what he saw. He described the development of the chick inside the egg with remarkable accuracy. He was doing systematic observational science in the 4th century BCE. But Aristotle knew that observation alone wasn't enough. You need a rigorous method of reasoning about what you observe. You need logic. And this brings us to maybe Aristotle's single most important contribution to human thought: formal logic, the syllogism. Now, I know what you're thinking. Logic? That sounds dry. That sounds like something boring you do in a philosophy class. But hold on, because Aristotle created here is the foundation of all rational argument. It's a structure that lets us move from what we know to what we can conclude with absolute certainty. Look at the example on your slide. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This seems obvious, right? Almost trivial, simple. But that's the point. Aristotle identified the structure that makes this argument work. He showed us that if you have a certain form, a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion, and if the form is valid, then if your premise are true, your conclusions must be true. This is revolutionary. It means we can analyze arguments independently of their content. We can say, I don't care what you're arguing about, politics, ethics, physics, whatever. If your argument has this structure, it's valid. If it has that structure, it's invalid. Aristotle systematically cataloged all the valid forms of syllogistic reasoning. He created what's essentially the first formal system of deductive logic, and this system, with some modification and extensions, remained the dominant framework for logical reasoning for over 2,000 years. It wasn't until the 19th century that mathematicians like Frege and Russell developed more sophisticated logical systems. Think about that. Aristotle's Logic was so good, so rigorous, so comprehensive that it took 2 millennia before anyone could significantly improve on it. But here's what really matters. Aristotle saw logic not as an end in itself, but as a tool. He called his logical works the organon, literally the instrument. Logic is the instrument we use to guarantee valid reasoning, to construct sound arguments, to move from observation to understanding. So when you pull it all together, the empirical observation, the dialectical examination of common beliefs, the rigorous logical analysis, you get Aristotle's complete method. Start with what you can see, what people believe. Examine it carefully, reason about it rigorously, build up the general principles, test those principles against further observations. It's a method that respects both experience and reason, both the particular and the universal, both what is and what must be. And this method, this is what Aristotle applies to absolutely everything, to the natural world, to human behavior, to political systems, to the nature of reality itself, which brings us to what we actually discovered using this method. Now we're going to talk about the grand architecture of Aristotle's thoughts. And I want you to notice something. These aren't just random topics he happened to write about. These are carefully structured, interconnected domains of inquiry. Each one builds on the other. Each one requires the other to make complete sense. Let's start with logic. And we've already talked about this, but I want to emphasize why it comes first. For Aristotle, logic is the foundation of all rational inquiry. You can't do physics without it. You can't do ethics without it. You can't do metaphysics without it. Logic gives us the structure of valid reasoning. It shows us how to move from premise to conclusion without making mistakes. It's a quality control system for thought itself. And notice what Aristotle does with syllogism. He's not just interested in whether an argument is valid. He's interested in whether it's sound. A sound argument is one that's both valid in form and has true premises. This distinction matters enormously because you can have a perfectly valid argument that leads to false conclusions. If you started with a false premise, here's a valid syllogism. All cats are purple. Socrates is a cat. Therefore, Socrates is purple. The form is valid, but the premises are nonsense. So the conclusion is nonsense. Aristotle understood this. He understood that logic alone can't give us truth. It can only preserve truth from premises to conclusion. So where do we get those true premises? From observation, from empirical investigation, from studying the actual world, which brings us to the second pillar, natural philosophy, what Aristotle called physics. Now, what we hear physics, we think of equations in particles in quantum mechanics. But for Aristotle, physics meant the study of physicists, nature. Everything that exists in the natural world and undergoes change, and that's a much broader category. Aristotle's physics investigates motion, causation, place, time, the fundamental features of the natural world. And here's what's fascinating. While much of it of his specific physics turned out to be wrong, we'll be honest about that, his questions were exactly right. He was asking the questions that any complete physics must answer. What is motion? What causes things to move? What is space? What is time? These aren't outdated questions. These are the questions that physicists are still grappling with today, just with more sophisticated tools. But Aristotle's physics included something modern physics deliberately excludes: teleology, purpose, Aristotle believed that to fully explain something in nature, you need to understand not just what it's made of and how it moves, but also what's it for, what's its natural end or goal. A seed grows into a tree because that's its natural purpose, to actualize its potential. An acorn's purpose is to become an oak. The heart's purpose is to pump blood. Everything in nature, Aristotle thought, was an inherent directness toward some end. Now, modern science rejected this idea. We don't talk about the purpose of gravity or the goal of evolution, but here's the thing. When we get to biology, to understanding living things, teleological language keeps sneaking back in. We can't help but talk about what organs are for, what behaviors are aimed at. Maybe Aristotle was onto something after all. And this brings us to the third pillar, the one that fascinated Aristotle the most. First, philosophy, what later thinkers would call metaphysics. The word metaphysics literally means after the physics, because these books came after Aristotle's physics texts in the standard arrangement. But conceptually, metaphysics comes before physics. It's more fundamental. Metaphysics asks, what is being? What does it mean for something to exist? What are the most basic features of reality itself? Aristotle calls this the study of being qua being as being, not being as physical, not being as mathematical, not being as ethical, just being as such. What makes anything and anything at all? And this leads him to investigate primary causes, the ultimate explanation for why things are the way they are. What's the first cause? What started everything? What keeps everything in motion? This is where Aristotle develops his concept of the unmoved mover, a being that causes motion in everything else, but it's itself unchanging. It's pure actuality, pure thought thinking itself. And this idea, this notion of a perfect, eternal, unchanging source of all motion and change, this becomes enormously influential in medieval theology. Thomas Aquinas will later identify Aristotle's unmoved mover with the Christian God. But notice the progression here. Logic gives us the tools to reason. Physics studies the natural world. Metaphysics investigates the ultimate nature of reality itself. Each level builds on the previous one. Each level requires the previous one, but goes deeper. And all of this systematic investigation of reality is not just abstract theorizing. For Aristotle, it has a purpose. It's meant to help us understand how to live, which is why we need the fourth pillar. In many ways, the most important one for Aristotle personally, ethics and politics. Because here's the thing, Aristotle isn't doing philosophy as some kind of intellectual game. He's doing it because he believes understanding reality helps us understand how to live well, how to achieve Eudaimonia, human flourishing, the good life. And we're going to dive deep into his ethics in the next section, but I want you to see how it fits into overall architecture. Logic teaches us how to think correctly. Physics and metaphysics teaches us about the nature of reality, and ethics teaches us how to live in accordance with the reality, how to actualize our potential as human beings. These aren't separate projects. They're one unified vision of human knowledge, all working together, all supporting each other. That's what makes Aristotle's philosophy so powerful, so comprehensive, so enduring. This is the architecture of thought, and now we're going to explore each room in this magnificent structure. All right, now we're driving into the deep end, metaphysics. This is where Aristotle gets really interesting and honestly really challenging, because we're not talking about things you can see or touch anymore. We're talking about the fundamental structure of reality itself. And here's where Aristotle's genius really shows. He doesn't just ask vague, mystical questions about what is real. He develops a practice, technical vocabulary, a set of conceptual tools for analyzing existence itself. And these tools, we're still using them today, 2,300 years later. Let's start with substance and hylomorphism. Now, hylomorphism sounds intimidating, but break it down. Hyle means matter, morph means from. Hylomorphism is just Aristotle's theory that everything in the physical world is a combination of matter and form. Think about a bronze statue. What is it? Well, it's bronze. That's the matter, the material it's made from. But it's not just bronze. A lump of bronze sitting in a corner isn't a statue. What makes it a statue is its form, its shape, its structure, the way that the matter is organized. And here's the brilliant part. You can't have one without the other. In the physical world, you can't have pure matter with no form. That would be completely formless, completely undifferentiated stuff, which doesn't actually exist. And you can't have pure form with no matter, at least not in nature. Aristotle thinks God might be pure form, but that's a special case. Every physical thing is this union of matter and form. This table is wood, matter, organized in a table shape, form. Your biological matter organized in a human form. The bronze statue is bronze organized in the form of, say, Athena. But here's where it gets really interesting. Matter and form are relative concepts. The bronze is matter relative to the statue's form. But bronze itself is a form imposed on more basic matter. Copper and tin are forms of even more basic elements. Itself forms all the way down, until you get to what Aristotle calls prime matter, pure potential with no form at all. Though he's not entirely sure what that actually exists as anything more than a theoretical concept. And this brings us to the second core concept, actuality and potentiality. This might be Aristotle's single most important metaphysical distinction. Look at your slide. Change is the movement from potential being to actual being. A seed holds the potential to become a tree. This is huge, because Aristotle's predecessors had a real problem explaining change. Parmenides said change was impossible. Being is non-being, isn't it? So how can something become what it's not? Heraclitus said everything is in constant change. Nothing stays the same. They seem stuck in this paradox. Aristotle solves it with actuality and potentiality. The seed isn't actually a seed, but it's potentially a tree. When it grows, it's not becoming something completely other than itself. It's actualizing a potential that was already there. You're right. Now actually sitting, I assume, but potentially standing. When you stand up, you're not becoming a different person. You're actualizing a potential you already had. The block of marble is potentially a statue. The student is potentially knowledgeable. The acorn is potentially an oak tree. Change, then, is the actualization of potential. It's the movement from what something can be to what it actually is. And this isn't just the abstract philosophical concept. This is how we naturally think about development, growth, learning, any kind of transformation. But notice something crucial. Not every potential gets actualized. The acorn might become an oak, or it might get eaten by a squirrel. The student might become knowledgeable, or might drop out. Potentials are real. They're generally part of what something is, but they're not guaranteed to become actual. And this is where Aristotle's teleology comes back in. things have natural potentials, potentials that flow from their form, their nature. An acorn naturally tends toward becoming an oak, not a pine tree. A human being naturally tends towards rationality, not flying. Understanding someone's nature means understanding its natural potentials. Now, let's look at how these concepts work together, because Aristotle isn't just throwing around random terms, he's building a complete system for analyzing reality. Substance is the most fundamental concept. When Aristotle asks, what is being? His answer is primarily being is substance. A substance is something that exists independently. In its own right, this table is a substance. You are a substance. The sun is a substance. But here's the key. A substance isn't just matter. It's not just form. It's the ununified whole, the particular thing that exists, this specific human being, this particular oak tree. Substance is what has properties, what undergoes change, what persists throughout time. And notice, substance are individuals, not universals, not abstract categories. Aristotle is disagreeing with Plato here. For Plato, the form of human is more real than any individual human. For Aristotle, individual humans are the primary reality. The universal humanity is just something we abstract from individual humans. It doesn't exist separately in some realm of forms. Form is what makes a substance the kind of thing it is. The form of a human being is what makes you human rather than a tree or a rock. It's your essence, your nature, what defines you. But form isn't separate from the substance. It's in the substance, making it what it is. The form of this tree is in this tree, not floating around in some separate realm. That's the whole point of holomorphism. Form and matter are unified, are united in the actual substance. Matter is the material substance, the stuff that takes on form. But remember, matter is always relative. This tree's matter is wood, but wood is itself a form imposed on more basic matter, cellulose, water, minerals, and those are forms imposed on even more basic matter. So when we analyze any substance, we're always analyzing a form-matter composite at some level of description. And which level we focus on depends on what we're trying to understand. And then there's teleology, purpose, goal, directedness. And this is where Aristotle really parts ways with modern science. For Aristotle to fully understand anything in nature, you need to understand its telos, its end, its goal, its purpose. Why does the acorn grow? To become an oak tree. That its natural end. Why does the heart beat? To pump blood. That's its function, its purpose. Now, Aristotle isn't saying there's some conscious intention behind all this. The acorn doesn't decide to become an oak. It's not like there's a little mind in there planning things out. Rather, it's built into the acorn's nature to develop in that direction. The telos is intrinsic to the thing itself. Think of it this way. The acorn's form includes not just what it actually is now, but what it's naturally directed towards becoming. Its essence includes its potential. Understanding the acorns means understanding where it's headed, not just what it's made of right now. And this is why Aristotle thinks you need 4 kinds of causes to fully explain anything. The material cause, what it's made of, the bronze of the statue, the formal cause, what kind of thing it is, the shape of the statue, the form of Athena. The efficient cause, what brought it into being, the sculptor who made the statue. The final cause, what it's for, its purpose, to honor the goddess, to beautify the temple. Modern science focuses almost entirely on material and efficient cause. We ask what it's made of and what made it happen. We've largely abandoned formal and final causes, especially final causes, teleology. But Aristotle would say we're missing something, especially when it comes to living things. To understand life and mind and human action, can you really understand what a heart is without understanding what it's for? Can you understand human behavior without understanding what humans are naturally aimed at? This is still debated. Some contemporary philosophers, especially in philosophy of biology, are trying to rehabilitate Aristotelianism, teleology, in some form because it turns out that purely mechanistic explanations sometimes feel incomplete when we're dealing with complex, organized, goal-directed systems like living organisms. But here's what matters most. Aristotle gave us a vocabulary. He gave us concepts, substance, form, matter, actuality, potentiality, teleology. That let us talk precisely about the structure of reality. Rather we agree with it, his specific answer or not, we're probably using his questions, his framework, his conceptual tools. When you ask, what is something made of? That's Aristotle's material cause. When you ask what kind of thing it is, that is his formal cause. When you ask what caused it, that's his efficient cause. When you ask what's it for, that's his final cause. You're thinking in Aristotelian categories, whether you realize it or not. That's the power of his metaphysical system. It's not just one theory among many. It's the framework that shaped how we think about reality itself. And now, having understood the structure of reality, we can ask, how should we live in it? What does human flourishing look like? What's a good life? And that's where ethics comes in. All right, now we get to what might be the most practical, important part of Aristotle's philosophy. And honestly, the part that's having the biggest revival in contemporary ethics, because Aristotle isn't interested in abstract moral rules or calculating consequences. He's interested in a much more fundamental question. What does it mean to live well? And the answer is Eudaimonia. Now, this word gets translated as happiness, but that's misleading. When we say happiness in English, we usually mean a feeling of pleasure, contentment, joy. You eat ice cream, you feel happy. You get good news, you feel happy. But Eudaimonia isn't a feeling. It's a state of being. It's human flourishing, living well, doing well, being fully what a human being is capable of being. It's the actualization of human potential. And notice how that connects back to his metaphysics. Just like the acorn actualizes its potential by becoming an oak, humans actualize their potential by achieving eudaimonia. So what is this potential? What makes human life go well? Here's Aristotle's answer. And it's going to sound strange at first. Eudaimonia is achieved through virtuous activity in accordance with reason. It's not pleasure, though pleasure might accompany it. It's not wealth, though you need some resources to live well. It's not fame or power or any external good. It's living virtuously. It's actualizing your rational nature through excellent activity over a complete life. Let me unpack that because every word matters. Virtuous activity, not just having good intentions, not just knowing what's right, actually doing virtuous things. Ethics is about practice, about action, about you actually live your life day to day in accordance with reason, because reason is what makes us distinctively human. Plants have nutritive souls. They grow and reproduce. Animals have sensitive souls. They perceive and feel and move. But humans? We have rational souls. We can think, deliberate, choose based on answers, or distinctive excellence in rational activity. Over a complete life, you can't be eudaimonion for just a day or a week, Aristotle famously says, "One swallow doesn't make a spring. One good action doesn't make you flourishing. It's about the overall pattern of your life, the trajectory of your character over time." Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Virtue ethics. Aristotle isn't giving you a list of rules like don't lie or don't steal. He's not telling you to calculate consequences and maximize utility. He's saying become a certain kind of person, develop a virtuous character, and then you'll naturally do the right things. Think about it like learning to play an instrument. At first, you follow rules mechanically. Put your finger here, press this key, count to 4, but eventually, if you really learn music, you don't think about the rules anymore. You just play. The music flows from who you've become. The music flows from who you've become as a musician. That's what virtue is like. At first, you might follow rules, be honest, be generous, be brave, but eventually, through practice and habituation, these become part of your character. You don't have to calculate whether to help someone. You're a generous person, so you just do it naturally. And this brings us to the golden mean, maybe Aristotle's most famous ethical concept and also one of the most misunderstood. The golden mean that virtue lies between two extremes. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wastefulness. Proper pride is the mean between humility and arrogance. But here's what people get wrong. Aristotle isn't saying always choose the middle option, or moderation in all things, or never go to extremes. That would be ridiculous. Sometimes you need extreme courage. Sometimes you need to be extremely generous. What he's saying is this. Every virtue is a mean, relative to us, between excess and deficiency. It's about hitting the right amount at the right time, toward the right people, for the right reasons, in the right way. Courage isn't just medium fear. It's having the right amount of fear given the actual danger. A soldier facing battle should feel some fear. That's rational, but not so much fear that he runs away, cowardice. And not so little that he charges recklessly into certain death, foolhardiness. The generous person gives the right amount to the right people at the right time. Not too little, stingy. Not too much, wasteful. And what's right depends on the situation, on who you are, and what's needed. This is why ethics can't be reduced to a formula. You need practical wisdom, forensics, to figure out what the mean is in each situation. You need experience, judgment, sensitivity to context. You need to become the kind of person who can perceive what's called for. And this is where habituation comes in. And this is crucial for understanding Aristotle's ethics. You don't become virtuous by reading philosophy books. You don't become courageous by understanding the definition of courage. You become virtuous by practicing virtue, by repeatedly doing virtuous actions until they become second nature. Aristotle says, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. It's like learning any skill. You learn to play piano by playing piano. You learn to be generous by practicing generosity over and over until it becomes part of who you are. But here's the paradox. How can you do virtuous acts before you're virtuous? If you're not yet generous, how can you practice generosity? Aristotle's answer, at first, you imitate. You follow rules. You do what virtuous people would do, even if it doesn't come naturally. A child learns courage by watching brave adults, by being encouraged to face small fears, by gradually building up the habit. And slowly, through repetition, through practice, through habituation, these external actions become internal character. The virtue becomes part of you. You don't just act generous, you are generous. It's not a performance anymore, it's who you've become. This is a radically different from other ethical theories. Kant says morality is about following universal rational principles. Utilitarians say it's about maximizing happiness, but Aristotle says it's about becoming excellent. It's about character formation. It's about actualizing your potential as a rational social being. And notice, this isn't selfish. Becoming virtuous isn't just good for you. It's good for everyone around you. The generous person makes their community better. The just person makes society better. The courageous person protects others. Virtue, ethics is inherently social, which brings us naturally to politics. Now here's where everything comes together, because for Aristotle, ethics and politics aren't separate domains. They're intimately connected. In fact, Aristotle thinks politics is the master science, the discipline that determines how all other goods are pursued in a community. And it all starts with this remarkable claim: man is by nature a political animal. Think about what he's saying here. It's not that humans choose from form societies for convenience or protection, like some kind of social contract. It's that we're naturally social. It's built into our nature, into our form as human beings. We can only fully actualize our potential, only achieve Eudaimonia within a community. Aristotle argues this brilliantly. Look at human beings. We have language, not just grunts and cries like animals, but actual speech that can communicate about justice and injustice, good and bad, right and wrong. Why would we have this capacity if we weren't meant to live together and deliberate about how to live? And look at what we need to flourish. We need education. Someone has to teach us. We need friendship. We're social creatures who need relationships. We need justice. We need fair ways of distributing goods and resolving conflicts. We need shared activities and common purposes. None of this is possible alone. A human being is complete. Incomplete isolation, Aristotle says, is either a beast or a god, either less than human or more than human, but not actually human, because being human means being part of a community, part of a polis. Now, this polis, the city-state, this is the natural form of human political community for Aristotle, not because it's the only possible form, but because it's the right size for genuine political life, small enough that citizens can know each other, participate directly in governance, deliberate together about the common good, large enough to be self-sufficient, to provide for all human needs. And here's what's fascinating. Aristotle actually studied 158 different city-states constitutions. He collected them, analyzed them, compared them. This is empirical political science in the 4th century BCE. He's not just theorizing about the ideal state. He's looking at how actual states function, what works, what doesn't. And what he discovers is that there's no single best constitution for all places and times. Different cities have different circumstances, different populations, different histories. What works in Athens might not work in Sparta. What's best depends on the people and their situation. But he does identify 3 basic forms of government, each with good versions and a corrupt version. Rule by one, monarchy, good, versus tyranny, corrupt. Rule by few, aristocracy, good, oligarchy, corrupt. Rule by many, polity, good, democracy, corrupt. Now notice Aristotle isn't a democrat in a modern sense. He thinks pure democracy, rule by the poor majority in their own interests, is actually a corrupt form of government. It's mob rule, the tyranny of the majority. What he advocates instead is what he calls polity, a mixed constitution that combines elements of oligarchy and democracy, where both the wealthy and the poor have a voice, where power is balanced, where the middle class is strong enough to prevent either extreme from dominating. Why? Because Aristotle thinks the best government aims at the common good, not the private interests of any one group. Tyranny serves the tyrant. Oligarchy serves the rich. Democracy, in his sense, serves the poor. But a good constitution serves everyone. It aims at the flourishing of the whole community. And here's where his ethics comes back in. A good political system is one that make it possible for citizens to become virtuous. The purpose of the state isn't just security or prosperity, it's enabling human flourishing. It's creating the constitution where people can develop excellent character, engage in virtuous activity, and achieve Eudaimonia. This is why education is so important for Aristotle. The state should educate citizens in virtue, not through indoctrination, but through practice, through habituation in good laws and customs, through participation in political life itself. And this is why he thinks some people should be citizens and others shouldn't. Now, this is the uncomfortable part. Aristotle excludes women, slaves, and manual laborers from full citizenship. He thinks they lack the rational capacity for full political participation. We need to be honest. Aristotle was wrong about this, deeply, profoundly wrong. His exclusions reflect the prejudices of his time and place, not any genuine philosophical insight. Women, enslaved people, workers, they have the same rational capacities as anyone else. But here's what's interesting. Aristotle's own principles actually undermine his exclusion. If humans are naturally political animals, if we flourish through participation in political life, its virtues requires practice and habituation, then excluding people from political participation prevents their flourishing. It contradicts his own ethics. Later thinkers would recognize this. They'd use Aristotle's own framework to argue for more inclusive politics. If the purpose of the state is human flourishing, and if all humans have the same basic nature and capacities, then all should have access to political life. So we can reject Aristotle's specific exclusions while still learning from his broader vision that politics is natural to us, that good government enables human flourishing, that the state exists not just for security, but for good life. And notice how this connects to everything else we've discussed. The metaphysics of form and actuality. The state helps citizens actualize their potential. The ethics of virtue. The state creates conditions for developing excellent character. The logic and method. Political science should study actual constitutions empirically, not just theorize about the ideal state. It's all one unified vision. Reality has a structure. Human beings have a nature. That nature includes rationality and sociability. Flourishing means actualizing our rational and social capacities through virtuous activity, and that requires living in a well-ordered political community. From metaphysics to ethics to politics, it all fits together. That's the power of Aristotelian philosophy. It's not just a collection of interesting ideas. It's a comprehensive framework for understanding reality and how to live in it. And this framework, it's about to shape Western civilization for the next 2,000 years. Okay, so Aristotle dies in 322 BCE. He's 62 years old. He's produced this massive body of work, hundreds of treatises covering essentially every field of human knowledge. And then, what happens? Here's what happens. Here's what's remarkable. Aristotle's influence doesn't just continue after his death. It actually grows. It spreads. It transforms. It adapts to completely different cultures, religions, and intellectual contexts. And it does this over and over again for 2 millennia. Let's trace this journey because it's one of the most extraordinary stories in intellectual history. Late antiquity. The first centuries after Aristotle's death, his works are preserved, studied, and commented on by succession of philosophers in the Greek-speaking world. But here's what's interesting. They're not just repeating Aristotle, they're interpreting him, extending him, sometimes combining him with other philosophical traditions. The Neoplatonist philosophers like Plotinus, Porphyry, and Proclus, they're primarily followed by followers of Plato, but they study Aristotle intensively. They write detailed commentaries on his works. They try to reconcile Aristotle with Plato. They show that the two great masters weren't really contradicting each other, but approaching truth from different angles. And these commentaries, they're crucial because when the Western Roman Empire collapses, when the libraries are destroyed and the schools close, these commentaries help preserve Aristotle's thought. They become the bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Aristotle's works largely disappear from Western Europe for about 700 years. They're lost, forgotten, unavailable. Medieval Europe has access to some of his logic, the basic logical works translated by Boethius in the 6th century. But the physics, the metaphysics, the ethics, the politics, gone. So where did they go? The Islamic Golden Age. This is where Aristotle's philosophy only survives but flourishes. When Islamic civilization expands in the 7th and 8th centuries, Muslim scholars encounter Greek philosophy. They translate Aristotle into Arabic. They study him intensively. They write commentaries. They integrate his philosophy with his Islamic theology. And they don't just preserve him, they develop him. They push his ideas further. They apply his methods to new questions. Al-Kindi, in the 9th century, begins the project of harmonizing Aristotle with Islamic thought. Al-Farabi, in the 10th century, writes extensive commentaries and calls Aristotle the first teacher. The master of all philosophical wisdom, Ibn Sina, in the 11th century, creates a massive philosophical synthesis combining Aristotelian metaphysics and Neoplatonism and Islamic theology. And then comes Ibn Rashid, known in the West as Averroes, in the 12th century. And Averroes is crucial. He writes detailed commentaries on virtually all of Aristotle's works. He defends Aristotle against critics. He argues that Aristotle represents the pinnacle of human reason, that his philosophy is compatible with religious truth. Averroes' commentaries are so influential that he becomes known simply as the commentator. Just as Aristotle is the philosopher, when medieval scholars cite the commentator, everyone knows they mean Averroes. Now, here's the fascinating part. It's through these Arabic translations and commentaries that Aristotle returns to Western Europe. In the 12th and 13th centuries, scholars in Spain and Sicily, places where Christian and Islamic cultures met, begin translating Aristotle from Arabic into Latin. Sometimes they're translating Arabic translations of Greek originals. Sometimes they're translating Arabic commentaries along with the original text. And when these works arrive in Western Europe, they cause an intellectual revolution. Medieval scholasticism. Suddenly, European universities have access to full Aristotelian corpus, and it's shocking, it's challenging, it's threatening even, because Aristotle offers this comprehensive, rational, systematic account of reality that seems to work without any reference to Christian revelation. He proves God's existence through pure reason. He explains the natural world through observation and logic. He develops ethics without scripture. So the question becomes, how do you integrate this pagan philosopher with Christian theology? Can you even do it? Or is Aristotle dangerous, a threat to faith? Some church authorities want to ban Aristotle. In 1210 and 1215, the University of Paris actually prohibits teaching certain Aristotelian works. They're worried about his ideas in the eternity of the world, on the nature of the soul, on the limits of divine providence. But then comes Thomas Aquinas. In Aquinas, there's something brilliant and audacious. He synthesizes Aristotle with Christianity. He shows how Aristotelian philosophy can serve as the foundation for Christian theology. He uses Aristotle's concepts, actuality and potentiality, form and matter, the four causes, to explain Christian doctrines. God is pure actuality, not potentiality. The soul is the form of the body. Grace perfects nature. Faith and reason are compatible. Reason can prove God's existence and many of his attributes, while revelation tells us what reason alone cannot reach. And Aquinas doesn't just use Aristotle, he transforms him. He Christianizes him. He creates a new synthesis that will dominate Catholic theology for centuries. In Aquinas' work, Aristotle becomes simply the philosopher. The philosopher as if there's only one who matters. When Aquinas writes the philosopher says, everyone knows he means Aristotle, not Plato, not Augustine, not any other thinker. Aristotle is the philosopher par excellence. And this synthesis, this Aristotelian Christian worldview, it becomes the foundation of medieval university education. If you studied at Oxford or Paris or Bologna in the 13th, 14th, or 15th centuries, you studied Aristotle. Logic, natural philosophy, metaphysics, ethics, all Aristotelian. His influence is so complete, so persuasive, that for centuries you couldn't be considered educated without knowing Aristotle. His works were the curriculum. His methods were the methods. His questions were the questions. And then something happens. The Renaissance arrives. The scientific revolution begins. And suddenly, Aristotle's dominance is challenged. So here's where we need to talk about Aristotelian decline, revival, because the story doesn't end with medieval scholasticism. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries explicitly rejects Aristotelian physics. Galileo drops balls from towers and shows that Aristotle was wrong about falling bodies. Newton develops a mathematical physics that has no place for Aristotelian teleology. The new science is mechanistic, mathematical, experimental, and it's not Aristotelian. Descartes, one of the founders of modern philosophy, makes his mission to overthrow Aristotelian scholasticism. He wants to start fresh, build philosophy on a new foundation, reject everything Aristotle taught. He essentially says, and begin again with clear and distinct ideas. And for a while, it seems like Aristotle is finished. His physics is obsolete. His biology is outdated. His logic, while still taught, seems limited compared to the new mathematical logic being developed. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Aristotelian becomes almost an insult. It means outdated, scholastic, dogmatic. But here's the thing. You can't kill Aristotle, because even when people reject his specific doctrines, they're still working within frameworks he created. Let's talk about science and logic. Yes, Aristotelian physics was wrong about many things, but the question Aristotle asked was, what is motion? What is causation? What is space and time? These remain the fundamental questions of physics. The methods he helped pioneered careful observation, systematic classification, empirical investigation. These become the foundation of modern science. His biology, while containing errors, was remarkably sophisticated. His classification system, his comparative anatomy, his embryology, these were serious scientific achievements. Darwin himself acknowledged Aristotle as one of the greatest biological observers. And his logic? It dominated Western thought for over 2,000 years. It wasn't until the 19th century that mathematicians like Frege, Russell, and Whitehead developed more powerful logical systems. But even then, Aristotelian logic wasn't wrong. It was just limited. Within its domain, it still worked perfectly. Modern logic extends Aristotle. It doesn't refute him. Think about that. A logical system developed in the 4th century BCE remained the gold standard for logical reasoning until the 1800s. That's not just influence, that's intellectual dominance on a scale we can barely comprehend. But here's where Aristotle revival really happens. In ethics and politics, this is happening right now in contemporary philosophy. For most of the 20th century, ethics was dominated by two approaches: Kantian deontology, focus on duty and universal rules, and utilitarianism, focus on consequence and maximizing happiness. Both approaches had problems. Both felt incomplete, somehow missing something essential about moral life. And then starting in the 1950s and really taking off in the 1980s and 90s, philosophers rediscovered Aristotle. They started developing what's called virtue ethics, a return to Aristotle's focus on character, on human flourishing, and what it means to live well. Philosophers like G.M. Anscombe, Philippa Foot, and Alasdair MacArthur, Rosalind Hursthouse, they argued that we need to recover Aristotelian insights, that ethics isn't just about following rules or calculating consequences. It's about becoming certain kinds of people. It's about developing virtues. It's about human flourishing. And this isn't just academic philosophy. Virtue ethics has influenced fields like business ethics, medical ethics, environmental ethics, military ethics. When we talk about professional virtues, about character formation, about what makes a good doctor or a good leader or a good citizen, we're often using Aristotelian frameworks, whether we realize it or not. In political philosophy, there's been a similar revival. Communitarian thinkers have returned to Aristotle's insights that humans are naturally social, that we're formed by our communities, that the good life requires good political institutions. They're pushing back against purely individualistic political theories by recovering Aristotle's vision of human as political animals. And in philosophy of mind, in cognitive science, in biology, there's renewed interest in Aristotelian concepts. Some philosophers argue that helomorphism offers a better account of the mind-body relationship than either materialism or dualism. Some biologists argue that we need teleological concepts to understand living systems, that purely mechanistic explanations are insufficient. Now, I'm not saying everyone agrees with Aristotle, far from it, but what's remarkable is that 2,300 years later, we're still arguing with him, still learning from him, still finding his ideas relevant and challenging. And here's what I mean. And here's what I want you to understand. Aristotle's deepest gift isn't any particular doctrine. It's not his physics or his biology or even his logic. As impressive as those are, his deepest gift is a way of thinking, a method, an approach to inquiry. He showed us how to start with observation, with phenomena, with what appears to us, how to take common beliefs seriously while subjugating them to rigorous analysis, how to develop precise conceptual tools for understanding reality, how to connect different domains of inquiry, metaphysics, ethics, politics, science, into a unified vision. He showed us how to ask the right questions. What is this thing? What is it made of? What makes it what it is? What is it for? What can it become? How should we understand its nature? And perhaps most importantly, he showed us that philosophy isn't just abstract theorizing. It's about understanding reality so we can live better. It's about actualizing human potential. It's about pursuit of wisdom in service of human flourishing. When your slide says, the human condition, Aristotle's deepest gift, a rigorous, compassionate inquiry into what it means to live well, a question as urgent today as in 350 BCE. This is exactly right, Because that question, how should we live? What is a good life? How do we flourish as human beings? That question never gets old. Every generation has to answer it anew. Every person has to figure it out for themselves. And Aristotle doesn't give us easy answers. He doesn't give us a formula or a rule book. What he gives us is a framework for thinking about the questions, a set of tools for investigating it rigorously, a vision of what human excellence might look like. He tells us, look at human nature. Look at what we're capable of. Look at what fulfills us, what makes us flourish, and then organize your life, your character, your community around actualizing those capacities. Be rational. That's your distinctive excellence. Be virtuous. Develop excellent character through practice. Be social. Engage with others in political community. Pursue knowledge. Understand reality in all its complexity. And through all of this, achieve Eudaimonia. That flourishing, that living well, that full actualization of human potential. That's the Aristotelian vision. That's the architecture of thought he built. And 2,300 years later, we're still living in the house he designed. We're still using the tools he forged. We're still asking the questions he taught us to ask. That's not just influence. That's not just historical importance. That's the mark of a mind fundamentally shaped what it means to think philosophically. That's the legacy of the architect of Western thought.